As we saw there, some are celebrating, others commiserating. What are the main reasons for both types of reactions over Brexit?
Those who are celebrating anticipate that there will be new opportunities. They've gone through many years of being disparaged by the urban elites, particularly those in London, and they resented the rule from Brussels, the great influence that Germany had over the European Union, and consequently they assume that they will be able to find a new place in the world. Those who are worried about it look at the possible losses, the fact that they do not have the access to this gigantic market, the EU, the way they had before, that they do not have the security of belonging to that larger group, that on its own Britain is a vastly smaller player than they were collectively as part of the EU. There are regional issues, as one of your correspondents pointed out. In Scotland, the majority voted to remain in the Union. So there are those regional disparities. There are urban versus rural. There are class differences. And Boris Johnson is right that he has to try to bring the country together.
And so now that Brexit is finally here then, what are the UK's priorities between now and that 31st of December deadline?
They have to look at trade. They have to look at immigration. Immigration was a huge issue. One of the problems was when Angela Merkel decided virtually unilaterally to allow 1 million refugees from the Middle East into Germany, and there's a free flow of citizens throughout the EU. That caused a lot of concerns in Britain, so the British want to have a greater control over the immigration into their country. In terms of trade, yes, they do want to preserve very good trade relations with the EU without the stifling bureaucracy that Brussels has become, but there are also great opportunities with the United States and elsewhere in the world. And Britain has been a trading nation for a very long time. So at this point, there are many things that Britain needs to do, lessons that they need to learn, but the EU also has to engage in self-reflection.
Right.
The way Britain left, and the reason Britain left, was not just something quirky, not just something that was sui generis to Britain. It was also a case that the EU has mishandled integration, that outside of the recipients of subsidies in Eastern Europe, many other people in Western Europe are really unhappy with the EU. Brussels has become distant.
Right.
It has become stifling. It has become insensitive.
So, Aurel, to that point then, as the first country to leave the bloc, and a major one at that, how does this reflect on the EU and its push for solidarity?
Well, they do have to preserve solidarity. I think the way they try to punish Britain ultimately sent the wrong message because Britain left. The way they will deal with Britain in the next several months, I think, could help both Britain and the EU. Macron, the head of the French government, has stated that there should be some reflection. Angela Merkel has also voiced concern that they have to be careful. She seems more conciliatory, but the problem is that Angela Merkel is about to leave, and we do not know what the new chancellor will be like and what the approach will be. So this is a kind of careful political choreography that the EU on the one hand, Britain on the other has to engage in. There are the bilateral issues, Britain on one side and the EU on the other side, and then there are the internal issues within the EU. The EU is not as strong as it seems. It is not as weak as some people assume it to be. It has indeed survived for quite some time now, but the ambition that the EU had to be an alternative to the United States and now an alternative to China, that is a very tall mountain to climb.
So you raise an interesting point then. In terms of trade deals then, which ones are going to be the most important to establish first?
In the case of Britain, it will range from something that seems economically on the margin, fishing rights, because after all, Britain is an industrial power, not a fishing power, but there's symbolism to that. But the industrial, the flow of goods, the cooperation of companies, the access to financial instruments. London is a great financial center. to be a great financial center, you have to be global, and you have to also be, in a sense, dominant in the region. So we'll have to see how much of that financial muscle will sort of atrophy, if you like, in the case of London, what they can keep, how much will be transferred to capitals like Paris or Frankfurt. How avidly will the Europeans try to take away from Britain? That could cause bad feelings. So there will be negotiations over that as well, and they will be very delicate, and I certainly hope that for the sake of all the parties involved, they will be more sensitive than they had been in the past, especially from the EU. There's a tendency to blame Britain for these problems,
right.
And they certainly carry part of the blame, but the EU has really badly mishandled this.
All right, Aurel Braun there, Professor of International Relations and Political Science at the University of Toronto.